The air was thick with an eerie silence as I stood at the edge of Hollow Hill Cemetery. My name is Dr. Emily Carter, an archaeologist with a penchant for uncovering the secrets of the past. The cemetery stretched out before me, a sprawling expanse of ancient gravestones and mausoleums, some of which dated back hundreds of years. The locals whispered of dark tales and restless spirits, but I was never one to be swayed by ghost stories. I had come to Hollow Hill with a purpose, to excavate and study the ancient burial grounds beneath the cemetery. There were rumors of artifacts and relics from a forgotten era buried deep within the earth. My team and I set up camp just outside the cemetery gates, ready to begin our work. The town of Hollow Hill watched us with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, their superstitions running deep. As we began our excavation, we unearthed fragments of pottery and tools, relics of a civilization long gone. Each discovery brought us closer to understanding the people who had once lived here. The work was exhausting but exhilarating, and I felt a thrill with each new find. It was on the third day that we found something truly remarkable. Deep in the earth, beneath layers of soil and rock, we uncovered a massive stone sarcophagus. The carvings on its surface were intricate and detailed, depicting scenes of rituals and ceremonies. My heart raced with excitement as we carefully lifted the heavy lid. Inside the sarcophagus lay the remains of a man, his skeletal frame draped in tattered robes. But it was not the bones that held our attention, it was the amulet clutched in his bony hand. The amulet was unlike anything I had ever seen, a dark stone set in a silver frame, inscribed with ancient symbols. As I reached out to touch it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly the ground beneath us trembled, and a gust of wind howled through the cemetery. The air grew colder, and an oppressive darkness seemed to settle over us. I looked around, feeling a sense of unease. My team exchanged worried glances, but I dismissed it as a coincidence, the result of our intense focus and exhaustion. That night, as I lay in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows outside seemed to move and shift, and strange noises echoed through the darkness. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, we returned to the sarcophagus, determined to document our findings. As we approached, we noticed that the amulet was missing. Panic set in as we searched frantically, but it was nowhere to be found. Then, one of my team members, Jack, let out a blood-curdling scream. We rushed to his side and found him staring at the ground, his face pale with fear. There, etched into the dirt, were the same symbols that adorned the amulet. It was as if someone, or something, had drawn them overnight. Jack pointed to the nearest gravestone, where the symbols had also appeared. A sense of dread settled over us as we realized that we had awakened something ancient and powerful. The stories of restless spirits and cursed grounds no longer seemed like mere folklore. We had disturbed a force that had been buried for centuries, and now it was free. As night fell once more, the cemetery came alive with ghostly whispers and flickering lights. We were no longer alone. The spirits of Hollow Hill Cemetery were restless and their anger was palpable. I knew then that our only hope was to unravel the secrets of this place and find a way to appease them before it was too late. But how? The answer eluded me, and with each passing moment the presence grew stronger, more malevolent. The haunting of Hollow Hill had only just begun, and the real nightmare was yet to come. The following days were a blur of terror and confusion. My team and I were plagued by unsettling occurrences, tools disappearing, strange whispers echoing in the night, and eerie figures glimpsed from the corners of our eyes. The sense of dread that had settled over us on the first night only grew stronger. One evening, as we gathered around our small campfire, we discussed our next steps. Jack, still visibly shaken from his earlier experience, suggested we consult the town's historical records. Perhaps there, we could find some clue to the amulet's significance and the identity of the entity we had awakened. The next morning, we made our way to the town's library. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, was an elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about Hollow Hill's history. When we mentioned the symbols in the sarcophagus, her face paled, and she muttered a prayer under her breath. "There are some things best left undisturbed," she said, her voice trembling. The cemetery was built on ancient burial grounds long before the town was established. The original inhabitants worshipped dark deities and performed rituals to appease them. They believed that powerful spirits guarded their dead. Mrs. Hargrove led us to a dusty section of the library where she pulled out an old leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed with age, and the text was written in a language I barely recognized. She pointed to a section that described the burial rituals and the amulets used to bind the spirits of the dead. The amulet you found, she explained, was likely used to seal a powerful entity within the sarcophagus. Removing it would have broken the seal. As she spoke, a chill ran down my spine. The implications were clear. By removing the amulet, we had unleashed a malevolent force. But what did it want, and how could we stop it? That night, back at the cemetery, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. As we resumed our excavation, hoping to find more clues, the ground beneath us seemed to pulse with a dark energy. We unearthed more relics, but they only deepened the mystery. Then we found it, a second sarcophagus, smaller and less ornate than the first, but with the same eerie symbols. Inside was a set of scrolls, remarkably well preserved. As I carefully unrolled one, I realized it was a ritual to summon and bind spirits. It was written in the same ancient language, but with Mrs. Hargrove's help, we could decipher it. We returned to the library, where Mrs. Hargrove translated the scroll. It described a ritual that could potentially bind the entity once more, but it required a sacrifice, a life given freely to appease the angry spirit. The weight of this revelation settled heavily on my shoulders. The town of Hollow Hill had suffered enough because of our actions. It was up to us to set things right, but the cost was unimaginable. As we prepared for the ritual, the entity's presence grew stronger, and the nights became even more terrifying. The time was running out, and the fate of Hollow Hill hung in the balance. We gathered in the cemetery under a moonless sky, the darkness around us almost suffocating. The air was thick with tension and fear. Mrs. Hargrove had agreed to help us perform the ritual, her knowledge of the town's history and the ancient language indispensable. The townspeople, though wary, had offered their support, hoping to rid their home of the malevolent force we had unleashed. We stood in a circle around the second sarcophagus, the scrolls laid out before us. The symbols inscribed on the ground glowed faintly, a testament to the power they held. I held the amulet in my hand, its cold surface sending shivers down my spine. Mrs. Hargrove began to chant, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The wind picked up, swirling around us, carrying whispers of the restless spirits. As the chant grew louder, the ground beneath us trembled and a dark shadow rose from the sarcophagus. The entity had awakened fully, its presence a suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The townspeople joined in the chant, their voices melding with Mrs. Hargrove's, creating a haunting melody that echoed through the cemetery. I clutched the amulet tightly, feeling its power pulsing against my skin. The entity seemed to recoil at the sound, its form flickering like a dying flame. But then, the chanting faltered. One of the townspeople, a young man named Ben, collapsed to the ground, his face contorted in pain. The entity seized the opportunity, surging forward with a terrifying force. I felt its icy grip around my heart, the darkness threatening to consume me. "No!" Mrs. Hargrove's voice cut through the chaos. "We must remain strong! Do not falter!" I forced myself to focus, joining the chant with renewed determination. The entity shrieked in rage, its form writhing and twisting as it fought against the ritual. The amulet in my hand grew hotter, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter. As the ritual neared its climax, I realized the sacrifice had to be made. The entity's power was too great, and without appeasement, it would never be bound. Tears filled my eyes as I stepped forward, accepting the grim reality. My life was a small price to pay to save Hollow Hill. "Emily, no!" Jack's voice was filled with despair, but I shook my head. "It's the only way," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We have to finish this." With a deep breath, I held the amulet aloft and began the final incantation. The entity screamed, a sound that pierced the very soul. The darkness around us seemed to implode, drawn towards the amulet. My vision blurred and I felt my strength waning, but I pressed on, determined to see it through. As the last words left my lips, a blinding light erupted from the amulet, enveloping the entity. The ground shook violently and the air was filled with a deafening roar. I felt myself being pulled into the light, the world around me fading away. When the light finally dimmed, I found myself lying on the cold ground, the amulet clutched in my hand. The cemetery was silent, the oppressive darkness lifted. The entity was gone, bound once more within the sarcophagus. The townspeople stood in stunned silence, their faces a mix of relief and sorrow. Jack knelt beside me, tears streaming down his face. "Emily, you did it," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I smiled weakly, the weight of the sacrifice settling over me. The nightmare was over, but the cost had been great. Hollow Hill was safe, but the haunting of Hollow Hill Cemetery would forever be etched into the memory of those who had witnessed it. And as I lay there, surrounded by the remnants of the past and the echoes of the spirits we had appeased, I knew that some secrets were meant to stay buried. The town of Hollow Hill breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the aftermath of the ordeal left deep scars. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reverence, now held a story of terror and bravery that would be passed down through generations. My team and I were regarded as both heroes and cautionary figures, proof of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface of history. The days following the ritual were filled with a strange quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to the cemetery lifted, replaced by an almost serene stillness. My team and I packed up our camp, ready to leave Hollow Hill and its haunted grounds behind. But the experience had changed us all. As we prepared to depart, Mrs. Hargrove approached me. Her eyes, though weary, held a look of profound respect. "You saved us all, Dr. Carter, but remember, the past should remain undisturbed. We have learned a valuable lesson here." I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The amulet, now safely sealed within a lead-lined box, was to be returned to its rightful place, deep within the archives of the town's library. It would serve as a reminder of the power we had encountered and the price of awakening ancient spirits. Back in my university office, I struggled to return to my usual routine. The memories of Hollow Hill haunted my thoughts, the faces of the townspeople, the screams of the entity, and the blinding light of the ritual replaying in my mind. I pored over the notes and relics we had brought back, trying to find solace in the familiar process of cataloging and research. One evening as I was working late, I heard a faint whisper. At first I dismissed it as my imagination, a lingering effect of the trauma. But the whisper grew louder, more insistent. I turned to see the amulet, glowing faintly through the box. My heart raced as I realized that the entity, though bound, was not entirely at rest. Determined to understand more, I reached out to Mrs. Hargrove. We spent hours poring over the ancient texts, seeking any clues about the amulet and the entity it bound. It became clear that our ritual, while effective, had not fully appeased the spirit. There was one final step we had overlooked, a way to bring true peace to Hollow Hill. With a sense of dread and resolve, I returned to Hollow Hill Cemetery. The townspeople watched silently as I made my way to the sarcophagus. Mrs. Hargrove and Jack accompanied me, their presence a comforting reminder that I was not alone in this final task. We performed the ritual one last time, this time with the addition of a rare herb and a specific chant we had discovered. The air grew thick with tension and the ground trembled once more. But this time, there was no malevolent force, no piercing scream. Instead, a soft, soothing light enveloped us, and a sense of peace settled over the cemetery. The amulet dissolved into dust, its power finally spent. The ground beneath the sarcophagus sealed itself, and the symbols faded away. The entity had been appeased, and the spirits of Hollow Hill were at rest. As I stood there, the morning sun breaking through the clouds, I felt a profound sense of closure. The haunting of Hollow Hill Cemetery was over, and the town could finally heal. We had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, and forever changed. I knew then that my work as an archaeologist was not just about uncovering the past, but also about respecting it. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, and some stories, no matter how tempting, were better left untold. With a heavy heart and a newfound respect for the mysteries of the past, I left Hollow Hill, vowing to carry its lessons with me always. The haunting had ended, but the memory of it would remain, a silent guardian over the ancient grounds, ensuring that the spirits of Hollow Hill would never be disturbed again.